getting back to the first presentation for Judith and Steve, I understood from your presentation that lifespan is a very important thing to consider when assessing the sustainability of a building. And why, according to you, the developers is stopping, or anyway is waiting to enlarge, to create buildings with a longer lifespan? Because in this way, if I correctly understood, the sustainability of the building itself would be achieved in a better way. Thank you.
I think, as I said, historically, there's a disconnect between those who produce buildings and those who occupy them. I think that, there are two things that developers address. One is legislation, because they have to, and legislation, in my view, doesn't adequately reflect long-term issues of owning and occupying a building. But the other is tenants, and that's where the crux lies. If there isn't a demand for the building, then there isn't a project. And up to now, tenants really haven't been demanding or haven't been demanding those sorts of things. I think that's changing, and one of the reasons is something that Nigel mentioned, is the changing dynamics of the workforce, not only Generation Y and the developing gender and age dynamics of the workplace, and these people want to know from their employer what they can provide to them to secure their loyalty. But I think also importantly, the rate of business change is ever increasing, and therefore tenants need flexibility and adaptability.
Perhaps one thing to add is, I think with social media becoming really mainstream, the workplace becomes a much more informal environment, and buildings and spaces have to reflect that a lot more. You might.
Yep. I think also there's a factor of I think there's also a part about long-termism in development generally, and I think too much development is about the next 7, 9, 10 years. They're not thinking about 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And I think the same is true of place. And it's interesting, Canary Wharf only coming of age now. That's how long it takes for places to become part of the city, for people to tie into them. We expect success much too quickly in terms of the city. And I think perhaps we need to start thinking in a more long-term way about buildings generally, as part of the general development strategy.
Have you ever worked, any of you, in one of these areas that have become abandoned during the last years? Meaning Detroit or any of the downtowns that have gone through one, let's say, dark period? Did you have the chance? Because I think that is something real at this point, and you seem to be marketing all the time things that are new, which makes sense. But more and more, there are old buildings that need another push, kind of. And I was wondering if you had the chance to be involved in one of those.
I'll take. Shall I take that? Yeah. Yes, I have. You're right. In Asia, we tend to focus on the new, but probably two examples: Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, which was an iconic, it still is an iconic tower, but went through an increase in vacancy, and we were brought in to try and rebrand it, reposition it. So we've worked in Hong Kong on that building. We've also recently worked on a much smaller building, actually, not a tall building, but 50 Connaught Road, that was considered in a fringe location in Sheung Wan, which, again, just the other side of Hang Seng Bank, if you know Hong Kong, not a traditional banking sector, and yet the rents are now the highest, it's the most expensive building in the world. We took that from a figure of, what was it, 70 Hong Kong dollars to 150 Hong Kong dollars on the gross. So we have had experience, but what we're seeing is that the downfall of the downtown locations is infrastructure, quite simply. And as an example, when I was marketing Guomao in Beijing, the problem that they have, the building, the management, everything is perfect, but getting to it is a problem. The traffic is just slowing everything down. The same thing with Guangzhou. And this is why we have more experience in terms of the new CBDs that are being created. again, it's why Canary Wharf was created. They realized that the key success factors to a new location is large floor plate, which you can't get, better infrastructure or accessibility, developers who probably got a good track record, and the Reichman brothers certainly did up until the point they went bust. Image was important, and then finally cost. I mean, these new locations offer a substantial cost. When you're up against that, in the case of Bank of China, you have to look really hard and deep in terms of how to bring it back up to life again. But it can be done. It has been done around the world. Just a few examples.
Yeah, I think as Nigel says, I think something has to be done. You can't just expect branding and marketing to plug the gap. And I heard a lecture by the branding guru Wally Olins, who said that he was invited to Naples by the Naples city government to advise them on how they could do a Barcelona, how they could transform themselves and their negative image to something akin to Barcelona. And when he arrived, they said, well, we put you up in a hotel, but be careful because there's a lot of thieves around the hotel. Oh, and don't worry about the rubbish, piles of rubbish everywhere, because the bin men are on strike. It's a bit smelly at the moment. But it's there's a lot of problems with the public transport striking at the moment, and don't worry about that. And then they went to the first meeting and said, so what can you do for Naples? He said, well, first you've got to make Naples a place that people want to go to, and then I can sell it for you. And I think that a lot of those places, there needs to be some change that happens in those downtown locations that need regeneration. And whether it's new business or new development, it's not enough just to rebrand it. And I think that Stratford is a very good example in London, which had been, it was a very, very poorly invested in, very poor housing supply, and it needed regeneration, but it needed an Olympic master plan, it needed an infrastructure investment in high-speed rail, it needed to become a major transport centre to do that. And then I think the process of marketing and making it successful becomes, realistic.
I will use these few minutes remaining for a personal, curiosity about. I'm very interested about the names of the tall buildings, because they are such interesting, but very different from the places in the globe where they are. No? So, and maybe you, William, can tell us something about the naming and not only the branding of a tall building, of a tower. So.
Yeah, I'd be careful. We've only got a couple of minutes, and I could go on a long time for this. I think it's. We were talking about this earlier outside of the session. I think London has a very interesting and particular quirk about naming buildings, which is that we like to give our buildings nicknames. And there's a fact in Britain that nicknames tend to be rude. And whereas in America, the Top Gun approach to nicknames is that you can call somebody Iceman or Maverick or something cool. In Britain, if you've given a nickname, you're sort of fatty or shorty or something rude. And that tends to be the same about our buildings. And I think it's the only market in the world where we have that approach. We have something amazing and spectacular that we should all be very proud of, and then we're rude about it. And I think I have lots of conversations with developers that say, I'd like to give our building a really good nickname, like the Gherkin, which is one of the things that made it iconic, or the Shard. And I say, if you give it a cool nickname, people are going to laugh at you. You have to wait for someone to give it a slightly rude nickname. And I don't think that's the case in other cities around the world. I think then, there are fewer buildings that are taking on the name of the developers that create them, because I think people don't necessarily want to be associated with somebody else's brand. They either want to brand it themselves, or they want it to be connected to some larger ideal. And I think the few examples where that's not the case, Chrysler Building, Chrysler aren't in there anymore. Rockefeller, a brand that probably a lot of people don't mind being associated with at all, and particularly, the building is old. I think Willis have obviously taken the whole of the buildings that they're in. But other than that, Trump is probably the only example of a developer that has a brand that's strong enough that people want to be associated with.
So, thank you all for coming. And thank you all for being speaker of this interesting session.
Thank you.